Welcome to Unveiling Death. I am Rabbi Jeffrey Weil. The Baha'i Faith and Death. Wherefore Dost Thou Grieve? With Lauren Herrmann and Jeremy Pane. Lauren Herrmann is a multifaceted creative and a certified death midwife. Jeremy Pane is a brick specialist at Lego and editor at Baha'i Publishing. Both Lauren and Jeremy were born and raised in the Baha'i Faith, and they live in and around the Chicago area. I'd love to hear from you, so please contact me at rabbiw14@gmail.com, and please follow and share Unveiling Death. Now here's my conversation with Lauren Herrmann and Jeremy Pane. Lauren and Jeremy, according to Baha'i teaching, Baha'i faith, what happens to or for a human being at the moment of death?
Well, from what Baha'u'llah has taught us, that's our founder of our faith, what happens is our soul becomes disconnected from the body dies, the soul is eternal, it still lives in the spiritual world. The spiritual world is all around us. It's not anywhere different from where we are now. It's essentially, you shed your physical body, you no longer see the world through the restraints of having a physical body, and so you receive a whole different level of awareness. This could also happen, multiple times throughout multiple spiritual dimensions throughout your eternity. We don't know that. We just know that when we physically die here, our bodies go away and our soul stays. Upon the moment of death, we have some type of reckoning where we understand what has sort of come as a result of our actions throughout our lives. I think that could be kind of equated as sort of a reliving your life or seeing your life flash before your eyes, however you might want to imagine that. I like to imagine it as understanding how my actions affected other people, good and bad. And then after that, all you have left to do is growth. What are you going to do with that information? Are you going to feel like your life was wasted? And are you going to be, sad about it? Or are you going to feel, see the good things that came? There's a lot, I think, emotionally that could happen in that moment. But after you sort of work through all of that, then all you have left is to just grow closer to God.
In a handful of places, a few of the writings and teachings of the Baha'i faith talk about the soul being like a bird held within a cage. And so the moment of death is like the bird being released from the cage. It's not necessarily that this great change does anything to the spiritual being that the human is. Instead, it's that it is finally released from the things that tie it to this world and kind of this understanding of existence.
Okay. So is there a self post-death when we shed our mortal coils? And you kind of mentioned that, the soul is released, but am I still Jeffrey after I die? Or is that something that I shed as well? Is that ego and identity dismissed?
So Baha'u'llah teaches that part of why we are here is to develop our virtues and our character. And so the light of our character, the aspects of us that are spiritual in nature, our aspects of our personality, are you a loving person, a generous person, patience, all of these spiritual attributes are what translate to the next world. So, and we should be able to, we're taught that we should be able to recognize people, but you recognize someone from the light of their presence, not necessarily like the way we identify each other here. I don't know, Jeremy, if you also want to share your thoughts on that.
I feel like I'm leaning heavy on metaphor, but a lot of the way that I kind of, both in growing up as well as understand, and this also exists within the writings as well. But I mean, is a baby when they are born? Clearly, they're no longer in their mother's womb. So there is both a little bit of a definite change with what they were to what they are. And at the same time, they're also one and the same. I think a lot of these things that, at least within the Baha'i writings, as well as from my own kind of personal understanding, there are a lot of mysteries that surround this, and it's hard to pin exact answers to spaces that we would not be able to have this conversation if I was there.
There's this concept of continuing evolution, development, right? After we die, is perfection in some way like the goal here? I mean, I guess maybe, of course, it is, but is that realistic? In other words, are we for eternity trying to perfect our characters morally, spiritually, whatever, after we die?
Within the writings, there are a lot of things that talk about this kind of ever progression to gain closer to the Creator, to gain closer to God. And in fact, the idea that through this planet, we draw closer to the Creator through messengers of God. This is our way of being able to gain access to kind of some of that understanding of the perfection that is God, that is the Creator. And so, to some extent, yes, we are constantly going to be striving for the rest of eternity to get closer to God. But on the other hand, that's very hard to say. I mean, here we are, the fish trying to imagine a world outside of the lake. It's very hard for us, time-bound beings, to try to imagine beyond a space that has time. So it's one of these really, really interesting spaces where we are progressing toward God, but what that looks like in this world and the next, and potentially any worlds that come after that, is a really, really interesting thing that is important for us to kind of consider.
Yeah, I always viewed it as, when I'm trying to overcome something like in this physical body, I feel like whenever I feel like I conquer something that I'm going through, or, achieve something or grow in a certain way, I feel like the next thing I need to work on, it just sort of default goes to sort of my next weakest thing that I need to work on. And so then I now have to work on that. And so it's like you have all these different aspects of yourself that you're continually trying to refine and get better. And everyone is different. Everyone has different capacities and stuff. So in the next world, like what Jeremy was saying, I think it's going to look different for each person. But ultimately the goal is to be more godlike, in terms of more virtuous, to develop these qualities. And I think we can still do that as we interact with this world. We're just doing it from a different perspective without a physical body.
Right. Wow. It's sort of like a process that continues. In other words, so if I'm understanding correctly, and maybe I'm not, but we are enabled through this world to learn and to grow and to learn from different teachers and so forth. It's just part of a process, and when we die, that process continues, and how long that continues and in what fashion that continues, that's like the fish trying to understand what it's like beyond the lake, I assume. But the process for each one of us and for all of us is a continuing, perhaps eternally continuing process towards of spiritual growth. Is that accurate?
Exactly.
Is there any conjecture? I mean, you made it very clear that we just don't know, and I appreciate that. We just don't know. But is there any conjecture in Baha'i teaching, Baha'i literature, of what that might look like? And I'm also wondering, is there a possibility of a reincarnation where we are incarnate again in order to continue that process?
Well, we don't believe in physical reincarnation. We believe that was more than likely a a teaching that was sort of had a physical, literal reinterpretation over time, and that we believe those worlds are spiritual in nature, that we do go through different states of spiritual sort of development. There is some conjecture, but it's not like canon, it's not, we're encouraged, if I have a thought about, life after death or whatever or something, and as long as it doesn't like directly conflict with one of the Baha'i teachings, I'm more than happy to have that, other thought, or my interpretation, how something, what it means to me personally.
Right. So would that come up? We had discussed consultations. Would that idea, let's say Lauren's idea about what might happen, or Jeremy's conjecture about what that might look like beyond the pond, so to speak, would that come up in a consultation about death in a Baha'i group? And can you explain these consultations and how death might fit into them?
There is a firm belief that that every human being, every human spiritual self, is endowed with the innate ability to gain, to recognize its creator, recognize God, and recognize gaining closer to God. And so often within the Baha'i communities, and this happens on international levels as well as in local communities and even within families, when there is a decision that has to be made, or when we are deepening on reading the writings and getting different perspectives on it, it's important that we include every individual's innate view on their own relationship with being able to recognize their creator. And through consulting about both things that are more conversational, as well as consulting about things that, are very specific and very important, that we're all unified in our movements together. Consultation is how within the Baha'i faith we do this.
So where is death, maybe codified or written about specifically in formal Baha'i texts?
There's many Baha'i texts where Baha'u'llah talks specifically about death, and also his son Abdul Baha. He would get asked questions, and so he would reply and respond to those. Some Answered Questions is a book that I recommend that has a lot in it about the soul, and death. Also, Baha'u'llah's Teachings in Spiritual Reality is another good book that has a lot of kind of pulls together from a few different sources and kind of categorizes it by subject. But it is in sort of various uncategorized teachings also.
So there's an openness and a directness about death in Baha'i conversations, consultations, and literature. Do you ever find someone in a consultation kind of getting very squeamish when the topic, any dimension of death comes up? Or is it just, is that very unlikely because it's so, it's encountered, or death is encountered or confronted so directly in Baha'i teaching?
So in my work as a death midwife, which is separate from my being a Baha'i, um, you have conversations about death, and, depending on how much a person had that growing up, it pretty much determines how comfortable they feel about it talking about it as an adult. In our society today at large, death is usually handed off to third parties. So most people, unless they grow up in a religion where you actually make that a part of your life, or you talk about it and you don't sort of, or there's not like tons of fear around it. I think that for me personally has helped me to be able to have these conversations. So I don't run into that as much in the faith, or in the Baha'i faith, as I do when I'm talking with people who are outside of the Baha'i faith.
I think that's a fair thing to say. It's hard to speak for Baha'is in general, because again, the Baha'i faith is a worldwide religion, and so every Baha'i, even though we are striving through the teachings of Baha'u'llah and the the institutions of the faith to understand kind of reality, there are cultural differences in terms of reactions of death that vary as much as people across the world vary. Um, at the same time, there are some very specific rules about death in terms of wrapping the body, in terms of washing the body, and in terms of what types of coffins or containers that the body can be in. And it's a very personal thing. And in most cases that I've known of, at least within the faith, these are done by often the washing of the body is done by the family members and the community in which the death happens.
If they want to, yes. I'm a little more familiar with that because I've done burial rites a few different times. So the family can participate if they want. Or they don't have to. Their community members can step in if the family doesn't feel comfortable doing it. But most of the time, there's at least a couple family members there.
So there's something in Judaism called the Hever Kadisha, which means the sacred community. And it's typically volunteers from the community who wash the body. It's called tahara, which it comes from the word tahor, which means purity, pure, to say, sort of do a ritual washing of the body and wrapping of the body in tahrichim or shrouds.
Yes.
And there are certain caskets that are considered more kosher, more suitable than others. So it seems like there are some parallels. So, Lauren, I know you grew up in a not very much a non-urban environment.
Yes.
And in your very much non-urban environment in which you were raised, death was really more immediate. And I wonder if you could talk about that and explain how that might impact both your faith or your belief about death as a Baha'i person and also as a death doula.
Yeah. So growing up in the country, obviously took it for granted. I assumed that this is how everyone was raised, obviously, like many kids I'm sure do. But yeah, we had lots of animals. They would die. I still remember when my first pet died. We would have, dad would bring in like maybe hit a rabbit with a lawnmower or something, or you'd see, animals that had like a deer that had been hit by a car, like driving into town or something, so there was just like, there was this sort of presence, and also this sort of idea of cycles. So it's like death was just a part of life. And that was kind of a normal, when we buried our pets, we knew that they were in the garden and they would help, become part of the soil. That's just part of understanding our reality in the environment we were in. And you burn the fields every year, and so that burn away the dead grass so that the new grass has room to come up. The green grass doesn't burn at all. It's only the dead stuff. So if you don't know that ahead of time, one person might look at that and see a bunch of destruction, but someone else will look at it knowing what the purpose of it is and see fertilization happening. So it's just it is definitely a unique perspective, and one that I think being a Baha'i definitely played into, because we have a lot of our teachings use metaphors in nature. So it helped me to be able to understand, I think, a lot more than maybe if I hadn't grown up around nature as much.
Jeremy, how about you? How would you respond to that?
Well, I grew up in a much more suburban. I grew up just outside of. It wasn't an enormous town, just outside of Kalamazoo in Michigan, and so I was definitely in a much more suburban environment. And one of the things that it kind of I noted, interestingly enough, growing up, we would have pretty. Pretty upfront conversations about death and the next world, and again, the learning spiritual principles, so that we would have more resources, more ability to operate within the next world when we did eventually pass. And so I did notice in a number of cases, both with going to a handful of family um, funerals, as well as both within and outside of the faith, I did notice that there was a bit of a distinct disconnect between how most of my friends would talk about death whereas I would. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that my particular growing up was necessarily normal, because, as we did mention, there are all sorts of different cultural relationships with this idea of death and the next world and things like that. But I did learn very carefully of who I could kind of speak about death with, and who maybe it would be better to not bring that up in quite the same way.
There was a certain point when I realized me talking about death, my peers did not really jive with that so much. As there was a moment when you realize, like, what you take for granted as a child is not interpreted the same way from outsiders, right? For people who don't know your upbringing. So I learned how basically the same thing that you just described. I definitely don't talk about this unless I know I'm talking to someone who is open to the idea of talking about it.
Wow, it's amazing. So you mentioned the next world. The next world has a name. Is that Abha?
We call it the Abha Kingdom, which just means a kingdom of glory.
Is it something that, just very personally, that we love life, we love our families, we love our learning, and we love our food and our whatever, music and arts and nature. But are you guys looking forward to Abha?
Yes, I would personally, yes.
Yeah, similarly, it's one of the I feel quite similar in this. One of the coolest ideas. We are told that in the same way that um, the souls of the next world are watching and praying for our continuation toward our Creator, that we're to pray for their progression as well. And that interconnectedness, to me, is just so extraordinary. And I mean, not to sound morbid, but I can't wait to learn more about that interconnectedness that I have always believed and felt must be here anyway.
Well, and then even in the writings, one of the writings is, I have made death a messenger of joy for thee. Wherefore dost thou grieve? I don't necessarily want to hasten my return to the world, because I still want to get as much growing as I can get done here, because the growing that we're able to do here, I think, can get us. I don't know. I think it's a very special type of growth that you can really only encounter when pitted against the physical world in our sort of dual natured being.
Lauren and Jeremy, I often conclude my conversations with this question, and so I ask thee now, as you lay dying, as you prepare to enter the kingdom Abha, what song would you like to hear, or what music would you like to hear at that time?
One thing that's very near and dear to my heart is the sounds of cicadas and pond frogs near where I grew up. So I definitely wouldn't be opposed to that. There's also this very, very vivid memory I have from when I was visiting in Japan at a very specific temple, and there were these like fresh flowers, and their voices, it just moved me to tears, and I feel like that would also be a nice on my ears.
Wow, I like that. Jeremy, how about you?
I always joked with my mother that I wanted my funeral to be a celebration, not a dirge. And so anything celebratory, but absolutely some upbeat music.
All right. Something like Wake Me Up Before You Go Go?
Sounds great. Let's throw it in the mix.
Let's throw it in the mix. Oh, Lauren and Jeremy, I have greatly appreciated talking to you guys and learning from you. So thank you so much for being on Unveiling Death.
Thanks, Rabbi Jeff, for having us.
Yes, thank you so much, Rabbi Jeff. This has been wonderful.
Thanks to Lauren Herrmann and Jeremy Pane. Thank you to my talented creative director, editor, and son, Sammy Weil. Thanks to my band, the Night Owls of Chicago, for the music you are listening to right now on SoundCloud. Share Unveiling Death with friends and enemies, and follow this podcast. Check out the Unveiling Death podcast playlist on Spotify. Many, many songs. And thank you for listening to Unveiling Death, Eternity in about 24 minutes, every other Monday.